Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And I'm joined today by Aaron Harper, who is Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at West Liberty University in Wheeling, West Virginia. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So, we're talking about your book, Sport Realism, a law inspired theory of sport, which came out last year in 2022 from Roman and Littlefield. And so, I guess just before we get into our main topic, which is going to be the issue of cheating in sports, could you just briefly tell us what sport realism is?
Sure. So what I tried to do in the book is defend a theory of sport, and there's been a lot of literature defending theories of sport over the last 20 or 30 years. And generally, I think it's accepted that what a theory of sport should do is a theory of sport should explain, first of all, what sport is, and then we can hopefully use that theory to help us address dilemmas or issues that arise in sport. So there have been some other theories. Formalist theories try to define sport primarily in terms of rules. Conventionalist theories try to define sport primarily in terms of the ethos of a sport. In philosophy of sport, the dominant set of theories have been, in recent years, have been interpretivist, or sometimes called broad internalist, where they try to identify um, a purpose or telos or sort of underlying principles of sport, and then use those to analyze sport. Suffice it to say, I don't think any of those theories work as far as the explanatory or the normative components of sport. But what I think some of them get right is looking to legal theory as a model, right? Philosophers of law like to use sport examples. I think it makes sense that philosophers of sport look at law, given parallels in institutions and legal language, adjudication, that sort of thing. So I call my theory sport realism because I'm drawing a little bit from the legal realist tradition that emerged in the early 20th century. But the rough idea, so for legal realists, they tended to argue that if we want to understand the law, we can't just, read the laws. We have to look at judges and courts and legal officials and see what they're actually going to do. We only know what the law is if we look at how it's actually being applied. So that's the basic idea of sport realism, is that if we want to understand what sports are, we can't just look at the formal features of sport. We can't just look for principles of sport. We have to understand how decisions are actually made. So I try to understand sport from the perspective of the participants of sports games. Right? If I'm playing a game, to me, what the game really is how the decisions are going to be made. So I'm sort of engaged in this predictivist, sort of future-oriented perspective. Right? If I'm engaging in some action, I want to know, is this going to allow me to win the game? Am I going to get penalized for the game? Am I going to lose the game? Like, how is this going to play out? Um, and of course, when it comes to sport, as opposed to say the law, when we're looking at the law, we're looking primarily at judges. And what I think is interesting about sport is there are a lot of different people that serve that adjudication function, right? So not just referees or umpires, sort of obvious cases, but for professional sports, there might be commissioners or other league structures that play that role. It might be managers, it might be other players, it might be fans, it might be media, right? So, in a sense, to understand sport, we have to understand how all of these different people make decisions that influence what I am going to do on the field or on the board or whatever kind of game I'm playing. And as much as a lot of the talk here is about officials, I'm hoping that my view, maybe better than a lot of other theories, works for informal games, pickup games, games that don't necessarily have clear rule books and officials. Or I think those often get um, left out of the analysis because we're focused so much on how do we apply this rule. It's like, well, I'm playing pickup basketball. Like, I'd like to think that um, my theory has something to say about those, right? So that's I don't know. That's probably the quickest sketch I can give of how I'm trying to shift the perspective for a theory of sports. And then what I try to do in the latter part of the book is make the case that my view better explains sport than other cases or than other theories, that it can do like the philosophical or conceptual work, which is I think what we're going to primarily talk about today, And as much as that I'm skeptical that other theories I think over moralize sports, I do think we have to be able to do some normative work. So I try to do some of that as well.
Awesome, thanks. And so, um, when I play pickup basketball, I adopt the role of the commissioner. Uh, like, all right, I'm gonna, dole out the salaries. I'm gonna, sanction players and teams, et cetera. That's my role. I don't like to be on the court. I just go
Makes sense.
home and I hear about stuff later. Um, awesome. So that's really cool, right? And I mean, I think, one upshot of at least the legal realist view, right, which I think, you're gonna either import or export, whichever metaphor we're going to use, to the case of sport, is that a law isn't a law if it's not being regularly applied, right? That if it's not in any way action guiding, right? If it sort of in
Mhm.
one's day-to-day life, right, or in like the day-to-day life of the members of the community, it's just not a law. It may be technically a law on the books, but it's a dead law, and a non-functioning law just simply isn't a law. And so, if you take that into the sports case, right, where we're not talking about laws anymore, but we're talking about rules, the formalist account are going to define sport in terms of, particular sports in terms of their rule books, um, the set of rules that are meant to be action guiding. But if officials aren't making a particular call anymore, right, and it's not affecting how players play the game, it's not a rule anymore, right? Yeah. So do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, and of course, then what we don't want to do is throw the rule out and say, well, it's irrelevant, right? I think that's the problem we run into with conventionalism is they have that insight. Well, sometimes the game's not played in the same way as the rule is written, but that also doesn't mean the rule doesn't have relevance, right? So one of the chapter where I'm sort of developing my view, I talk about sort of rule oriented realism and what role does the rule have, and again, if I'm either thinking of this as somebody in the legal realm, being affected by laws, like I'm doing this thing, I might be fined for speeding or whatever, or if I'm a lawyer and I want to know how what is this judge going to decide in this case, or how is this going to apply to the person I'm defending or prosecuting. The rule is probably part of the story, right? So it wouldn't make sense to throw it out entirely, but I also need to know what are cases where the rule isn't applied, or what are exceptions. What I want to do is sort of look at the case history, or look at, sometimes realists call this the situation type, right, and try to understand patterns. And what I think legal realism really gets right, and this is something I try to, I can't just take the legal theory and apply it directly to support, but I could have borrowed this idea, is a lot of legal theories want to distinguish between legal and non-legal reasons, right? That if I'm engaged in legal practice, there's a proper set of reasons that I can apply in making a decision, and then there's a different set of reasons that are out of bounds. And the legal realist sort of says, well, look, when we're trying to figure out what a judge is going to do, for instance, I have to look at all of those, right? Because the judge might be motivated by non-legal reasons, right? So if I make this conceptual distinction, but that conceptual distinction isn't matching up with the practice of law, what good was this for anybody, right? So there's an underlying pragmatism to my view. So yeah, I want to say that about law. I would say this about law and sport, but for our discussion today, we'll focus on the sport part. Um, yeah, when we're understanding, is this rule going to be applied? Um, we have to look at all of the other factors behind, or that are going into that decision, whether it's the decision made by an umpire, whether it's a decision made by you as the commissioner, whether it's how other players on the team are going to respond to it. So we can't just rule some of those out because we think they're inappropriate, because they very well might be factors in understanding what's going on. Now, we could argue, normatively, we don't think they should be factors, right? I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate view. But if we're trying to understand how sport is played, and we're trying to build our theory from what is it, what is this, what's actually going on in the sport, I think we have to take that perspective. But yeah, to get back to your earlier example, if there's a case where there is absolutely no expectation that something will be enforced, and I have and it plays absolutely no role in, yeah, it's not action guiding in any way, then yeah, I'm sort of inclined to say, even if it's written down, that's not actually the sport. And I think that's a little bit different from just saying like, oh, there are unwritten rules. Like, I think this is trying to understand, well, what is the sport? And if that plays no role in the sport, at least as it currently is, it's not part of the sport. Now that could change if things become enforced differently, or a new commissioner. We've seen this in baseball, where they've started to crack down on what pitchers are able to use, and like, well, okay, things have changed, because for a long time, sort of the joke was pitchers will do whatever they can get away with, and that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
Yeah, awesome. And so, a non-sports case might be helpful here. And so, a case that when I teach philosophy of games, my students get insanely excited about is Uno. Why? Because nearly everyone who plays Uno plays it incorrectly, right?
Mm-hmm.
The rules of Uno do not allow you to stack draw twos. They don't allow you to use the wild draw four whenever you want. You can only use it if no other move is available to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But no one follows those rules. And no matter how many times Mattel, who owns Uno, tweets, you can't do these things, people just like flame them in the comments, because it's like no one follows the rule, at least those two rules of Uno. And so, some people in the philosophy of games, and I guess these are more like the formalists, uh, are like, well, look, if you're not following the rules, you are playing a distinct game from Uno, right? Uno is defined by this set of rules. You are playing a variant of Uno, but it ain't Uno itself. And so, how do you think about a case of that sort? And then we can get back into sports.
Yeah, well, what I think there's sort of a couple of versions of that, because I think you might also have a related case where the people are playing by the same set of rules, but you still have different practices or traditions that sort of emerge from it. So in the case where uh, Mattel says this is one set of rules, and nobody does it that way. Yeah, I guess I'd be sort of happy to say like that's the variant that's currently being played now, and we could imagine that sort of changing over time, whether intentionally or not. If Mattel, I don't know how they would do this, but if they somehow decided to start really enforcing this, if we find that you're playing Uno by your own variation, like we're taking it away, you can't play it anymore. That might have an effect, or just games over time, sometimes will change, or different variants um, emerge. Now, I can also imagine a case where you had basically the same set of rules, just in different locations, and they were playing it differently, right? So maybe there's like West Coast Uno and East Coast Uno. And I talk about this in the book with baseball, between differences between Japanese and American baseball, right? Where um, I think there are some minor rule differences, but you could readily imagine two locations where they play baseball and they have the exact same rule book. But then when we look at the decisions that are made over the course of many years, we're going to find that cases get adjudicated differently. There are different expectations about what our umpire is going to do in certain cases, or how will fans react to something, or what's the manager going to do. And my approach to those cases is I basically want to look at them as different legal systems, right? So if I'm moving from one place to the other as a player, if I'm playing if I've been playing West Coast Uno all my life, and I've now gone to the East Coast and I'm playing an Uno tournament, um, well, in order to play that, what I have to do is understand this is how decisions are made here. These are the factors that are relevant, and it would be no different than a lawyer moving to a different jurisdiction, where maybe the written laws are more or less the same, but now there's a different court history, right? There's a different constitution, there's a different judge. I'm not doing my job if I'm not understanding how those differences play a role. If I just say, well, here's my book of laws, it looks basically the same, I'm not going to be effective, because I haven't put those concepts into practice, right? I want to say law, and especially sport, they're not just whatever the formal features are, right? We have to understand how these are put into practice, but we also can't just throw everything away and say, it's just conventions, right? Because I think that's a pretty superficial analysis. And I think that also, if we go that way, it doesn't allow us to do any of the normative work, right? If we say sport is just the practices of the sport, we've undercut our ability to criticize um, when we think things need to be changed. And I think that's a challenge for every view of sport, to try to both connect the explanatory part to the normative part, because we want to say this is what sport is. But sometimes we need to take the perspective that sport ought to be something different. And I think it's really easy to do one or the other of those, right? It's really easy to say this is what sport is now, or it's really easy to say this is what it ought to be. What I think the challenging part is connecting those. And I attempted to do that in my book. I guess you can all read it and see if you think I've succeeded. But I think that's where the challenge is, and I think where a lot of the work needs to be done.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's segue then to cheating, which you devote a chapter in the book to, which I think you can't talk about sport, especially on like a legal model, without talking about violations of rules and, the case of cheating in particular, because it's, at least in terms of like professional sports or like college level sports, like cheating is an issue, right? And it's an important issue, especially given the billions of dollars that are involved in, within the leagues themselves, but also among gamblers, essentially, given that they've all seemed to have partnered up with, online gambling firms. And so I'm just going to throw out an account of cheating that seems prima facie plausible, and I want you to tell me what you think about it, right? And so here again is just a naive, I guess, account of cheating, right? I wrote it down, so I'm going to read it. So
Okay.
cheating is intentional rule breaking done to unfairly advantage oneself or one's team in a deceptive manner, right? That you want to get away with it, which means you don't want the other people, the other team, to know that you're cheating, right? And so what do you think of just that prima facie sort of maybe folk notion of cheating?
Yeah, I think the short answer is every one of those terms is disputed, and there's surprisingly little philosophical agreement about it. I mean, I think that's, as you suggested, what could be more central to philosophy of sport than cheating? And I think there's so much literature on cheating, and most of it sort of takes something like that for granted. But then there's been some recent pushback to say, well, wait a minute, there doesn't seem to be a definition that's working in all of these cases. So I think that's the real problem, is that definition doesn't line up with how we actually look at cases on the ground, right? So is the problem our conventions, or is the problem the definition, right? And I guess I would say the problem is the definition, right? So if we just sort of take those terms quickly one at a time, right? Unfairness is challenging, right? Because whatever game or sport we're playing, there are probably some um, built-in advantages that we might have, whether those are, in many cases, they're related to finance, or they're related to access. They might be related to geography. So, we expect a sport to be fair when everybody's playing by the same rules, but that also means we expect there to be sort of a level playing field, right? And it's not really clear that you can have a level playing field, um, at least with sport, because sport inherently brings in the physical skill, right? I think that's where sport differs from games, is in sport, however we're defining sport, part of the definition is going to be that your physical skills in some way affect the outcome of the game. But now we're also dealing with like inherent genetic differences and that sort of thing, right? So if somebody is much taller or has incredibly efficient lungs or something like that, I mean, that doesn't seem unfair, but it also doesn't exactly seem fair. So that's puzzling. A lot of work on fairness tries to really get it, not that there's an advantage, because of course the whole point of sport is to get an advantage, but maybe it's how you get the advantage. So there never seems to be a very clear, easy line, right? There are always attempts to say, well, this is allowed or this is disallowed because it's a shortcut, or because it's unnatural or it's violates the integrity of the activity, right? But again, that doesn't seem like a very clear line, and we can find plenty of examples where here's one thing that's allowed and here's something else that's not allowed, and they look all for all the world like they're basically the same thing. Um, so those are just like a quick sketch about some of the issues with unfair advantage. Um, with the rule breaking part, I mean, on the one hand, that sort of seems obvious. Cheating must have something to do with breaking rules. There are seemingly different kinds of rules in sports. It's not clear, whether cheating involves breaking one kind of rule but not the other. It seems like the word gets used for all kinds of rules. There are many cases where we sort of applaud rule breaking. Again, baseball is the best philosophy example because it's the weirdest sport with regard to rules. But baseball has a long tradition of a sort of a winking at rule breaking and accepting certain kinds of rule breaking and not others. And there are some philosophers that argue rule breaking is great because it just makes the sport like a better test. Um, and if there's something morally wrong there, it might have something to do with, are you breaking a contract or a promise that you've made? But that's philosophically puzzling, right? Have you made a contract with the other players? Have you made a contract with the league? Have you made a contract with the sport itself? None of those really seem to be doing the work that we want cheating to do, and people do break those all the time. So if there is some moral weight to a contract you make with fellow participants, it doesn't seem to be very strong, and it doesn't seem to have the weight that when we say someone's a cheater in sport, that's pretty much the most morally weighted thing we can say about them. That doesn't seem to be fleshed out by you broke a promise that you made to the opposing team or something like that. So again, it's not that rule breaking and advantage don't have anything to do with cheating. I think they've got to be part of any reasonable definition. But if we were hoping there was a clear account that applies consistently across sport, it just doesn't seem that any of those concepts do that, unless we're all just really, really wrong in how we ordinarily think of sports, right? And I'm not inclined to think that we're all just simply that mistaken. And the same with deception, right? Often cheating requires deception, but sometimes you could cheat openly if you can get away with it, right? So none of these, the argument goes, seem to really define a core sense of cheating, right? That in some cases it captures things we don't want it to capture, and then in other cases it leaves out things we did want to capture. And I think that suggests some limitations in our analysis.
Yeah, awesome. And so as you were talking, I was like writing some stuff down as it came to mind. And you mentioned lung capacity, and even before you said that, like I was thinking of Michael Phelps and like his freakish lung capacity, right? And so we could imagine that he has like double the lung capacity of every other swimmer at his level, right? Well, it would seem to be fair if we just took a lung, right? Clearly we're not going to do that, but it's not Michael Phelps's fault unless he's been like secretly using illicit substances or something to, ban substances in the sport. But I mean, that also gets into issues of like almost eugenics in a sense, right? And sport sort of has that within it, right? With respect to racial issues, right? And with respect to issues of gender, like testing women athletes to see not just whether they've use banned substances, but also, what their testosterone levels are, what their estrogen levels are, right? And all of that's done to preserve the integrity of the sport, right? Whatever the hell that means. And, related to that banning trans athletes. And so what does that mean? And the baseball case is a great one because, back in the 90s when Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa and then Barry Bonds were, hitting home run after home run and breaking record after record, it was obvious that they were using steroids and human growth hormones. I mean, Barry Bonds' head doubled in size, right? Essentially. And everyone loved it, right? And so you talked about baseball having like a winking relationship to the rules, and so I've just said a lot of stuff related to like human bodies essentially, and
Mm-hmm.
the nature of human bodies and their natural or unnatural enhancement, and what that has to do with the notion of integrity to the sport. And so, like, talk about some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, those are all attempts where we want to find a clear line, right? Here are the things, if you take this protein shake, that's natural, and if you get LASIK surgery, I guess that's fine, so that's natural. But this steroid, wrong, right? Blood doping, infuse or taking your blood out and increasing the oxygen level and putting it back in, right? That's wrong. But getting an altitude tent for your house, that's okay. Right. I think these are all, it's really tough to come up with a consistent explanation. I think there's some inherent arbitrariness to this. That's not to say there are some really obvious things that we can probably say, okay, here are some things that are way out of bounds, and here are some things that we're sort of okay with. But this kind of gets to my earlier point about over moralizing sport, right? What I think a lot of philosophers, a lot of theories want is they want there to be a clear heavy duty moral explanation for where we draw the line. And if we want to say, look, rule breaking is wrong because this was the rule and you knew it was the rule and you went against it, like, okay, I guess that's fine. And I think there are various ways we can say that's morally wrong. But I think in some ways that's the less interesting moral question. What people want is they want there to be a good reason why that was the rule itself. And and that's what I'm skeptical of, right? Now again, if we look at baseball, we might say, well, look, there's lots of reasons why we don't want people to take any sort of substance. Um, but we also can't just ban every possible substance. So we're going to have to draw a line somewhere. And that doesn't mean it's completely arbitrary and there are no philosophical considerations. But if we're trying to hang on to one of these concepts, right? This is what's natural and unnatural. This is what's a shortcut and what's not a shortcut. This is what makes somebody. This is the one defining feature of what counts as a women's sport and what doesn't count as a women's sport. Something like that. I think the answer to these cases is, well, we had to draw a line somewhere and we had to come up with some reasons. Those aren't always moral reasons. I mean, I don't know if this is a great analogy, but why is a basketball hoop 10 feet tall? Does it really matter? Well, if it was 4 feet tall, that probably wouldn't be a very effective game. And if it was 25 feet tall, I mean, that wouldn't be the most effective game. But you could play that. You could have 25-foot basketball and you could have 4 feet basketball. There are probably some reasons to have it roughly the height it is, but why have it 10 feet instead of 10 and a half feet? I don't know. I don't think that's a particularly interesting moral question. And I think this is probably where we get into reasons that have to do more with pragmatism, or maybe have to do with entertainment, or maybe have to do with fun for the players or something like that. That's why you have lower hoops for little kids, because my 6-year-old can't get it to 10 feet. She can't get it to any of the feet. But that's not itself really a moral question, right? And that's something I try to spell out in the last chapter of the book, where I try to discuss some a pragmatist approach we might have towards sport. But I would say the same about some of these, like doping cases, steroid cases, where there might be some good reasons at the margins. If there's a substance somebody could take where every ball they hit is a home run, there's probably some reasons to not allow that. Or if people are taking substances that are really, really, harmful to themselves, we probably have some reasons to rule those out. Some of those might be external to sport. What I think theorists of sport want to do is they want to find something in the sport itself. They're like, aha, here is the standard. And that's where some of my skepticism comes into play. I think there's a lot more arbitrariness there than we want there to be. And at the end of the day, yeah, cheating has something to do with rule breaking. And we can talk about that in more detail. But the rules themselves are probably a little bit arbitrary, and we had to draw some lines, and we have some reasons to draw those lines. Those reasons may not be always moral reasons.
Yeah, right. And so, how then should we think of cheating on your view, right? It's a pragmatic thing. It has to do with the nature of the rules, which are themselves arbitrary and meant to be action guiding. And so, how should we think of cheating then, on your view?
Yeah. So back to if the goal of my theory is to look at sport from the perspective of the people playing it, I would say, well, what do we want out of a concept of cheating? We don't just need something that definitionally works. What I want to know, is this thing I'm doing going to get me punished in some way? Maybe punish isn't quite the right word here, but if I engage in this action, right, if I make this play, if I commit this foul, whatever it is I'm doing, and is it going to work? Is it going to get me closer to winning the game? Or is it going to result in some kind of sanction, right? So just as, or not just as, but for legal realist would say something like, you find the law when you find the thing that's going to trigger a sanction from a judge or a court. But I would say something like that is going to be a better definition of cheating, right? An action is going to be cheating when it warrants a certain kind of sanction or punishment from somebody in this category we could count as an official. So what I want to do, I do think it's important to define cheating, because if we can't come up with a clear definition of cheating, I think the worry is the concept just kind of becomes meaningless. And I think we do see this a little bit. Sometimes cheating is just thrown around as a term of disapprobation, right? I don't like this thing this other player did. I don't like this thing this team did. Therefore, it was cheating. Um, and it was unfair, right? Unfair and cheating are sort of just labels that get thrown around. And I think it would be sort of unsatisfactory if cheating and unsportsmanlike behavior and gamesmanship all kind of ended up being the same thing of actions we don't like in sport, right? So I think that's the value of doing some philosophical work here, is if we can articulate these different concepts, what we can really do is identify different kinds of wrongdoing. And I think what we have to do is sort of separate the moral background of these, right? So the analogy I use in my book is to compare it to legal analysis of negligence. Like there's a value to defining negligence in your philosophy of law textbook. That's not the end of the story. What you really want to do is, if I'm a lawyer, I want to know, is this action, or I guess in the case of negligence, omission, is this omission going to be treated as negligence, right, in this jurisdiction or something like that, right? Now, is it the case that negligence is morally wrong? Probably. Like, I suspect in most cases, negligence is acting in a negligent manner is morally wrong for any number of reasons. But that doesn't define what the wrongness is in legal terms, right? So I want to separate in law, we would separate morality from the law. And I want to do the same in sport. Is cheating morally wrong? Probably. There's probably a number of different things we could say about cheating. Right? It's perhaps it's disrespectful. Perhaps it is promise breaking. Perhaps it's wrong from whatever other moral theory we're adhering to. But I think that's sort of uninteresting, right? Just to say, well, cheating in sport, it did this, it was morally wrong. I think that sort of misses the context of, well, what does cheating mean in sport? So I think rule breaking is probably a necessary condition of what cheating is. I think there are some interesting cases we could talk about on rules being cheating. But I think what we say about cheating is it's yeah, rule breaking is a necessary part of it, but not sufficient, right? Because we know there are cases where rule breaking isn't treated as cheating. And I think cheating also has a distinct kind of sanction, which I call a restorative sanction, right? So whatever cheating is, it's an attempt to disrupt the like competitive equality, to make the game in some way weighted more towards one of the participants than a different participant. So what you would be doing when giving a sanction or a punishment or a penalty, any of these terms is sort of fine on my view, is you're doing what you can to restore the conditions back to at least what they were before that. As opposed to, like, I think a lot of times, um, especially with unwritten rules, we get punishments for different sorts of reasons, right? So baseball is filled with punishments, right? You do something that other players don't like, and you get in a fight, as we saw the other day, or you get a ball thrown at you by the pitcher or something like that. And I think we could say, well, those aren't in a sense penalties, but they're like etiquette penalties. Like, you did something we don't like, therefore this penalty is to make you sort of do the thing we like you to do. And I think cheating is different because it has something to do with the equality of the match itself. So again, this was maybe a roundabout way that isn't a precise enough definition that works for a YouTube video. But cheating, roughly, I would say, is an action that, if we caught it, would warrant a sanction from some kind of sport official because of the way it broke a rule that would affect competitive equality in some capacity. We could expect that to be the result.
Yeah. And what role do intentions play in it? Because that's one where you didn't mention in the definition you just gave. At least I don't think you did. Is intention, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go for it.
This is the most unorthodox part of my view, I suppose, right? Because I think pretty much everybody says that cheating has to be intentional, right? We think for various reasons it's really important to differentiate intentional rule violations from accidental rule violations. And again, I guess from a moral perspective, maybe there are some reasons to do that. We have an example I can get to, but I think from the perspective of somebody playing the game and wanting to know, this thing I'm going to do, or this thing I might do, or this thing that could happen, whether I intend it or not, I think there are at least a few examples where intention is irrelevant to whether something sort of looks like cheating, right? So imagine a case where somebody is running like a 10K or something, and they miss a turn, right? And they like cut the course, right? So they've taken a shortcut on the course. And let's say it wasn't intentional. I think that case is going to be indistinguishable from cheating, right? If you had two people who both cut the course in the same way, and one of them, it was a plan all along. They thought, well, I'm behind this tree, nobody will see me. I'm just gonna, cut this corner and cut a couple of blocks off this 10K. And somebody who maybe followed them and thought, oh, okay, I guess this is what the course is. I think what we would say is we would expect the same sanction in both cases, right? In this case, there's not really a sanction. You can't just add 30 seconds to their time. So in both cases, they're just going to be out of the race, right? And I think there are other cases like this. In some cases, maybe it would be prior behavior, right? If somebody has cheated before and they do a similar action again, I think we would have reason to expect the same sort of sanctions. So on my view, cases like that are, I think for all practical purposes, we might as well call them cheating, because from the perspective of those involved, they have the same result. Now, if we wanted to engage in moral analysis, maybe we could do so. Like there was this case a few months ago where somebody was doing, I think it was like a 50-mile, ultra marathon or something. Like, I don't remember the exact distance. I think it was something like that. And she finished third, but it turns out she had like gotten a ride in a car for like 3 miles, and this was discovered on Strava, right? People went on the running app and were like, "Wait, she ran like a minute and a half mile. Like, you can't do that, right?" Um, I guess the intentions there are, she kind of just said like, I was disoriented and didn't know what I was doing. But if somebody is like trying to win the race by getting in a car, I think we would say that's probably morally worse than somebody who like accidentally cut the course because they got confused. But I think from the perspective of the sport, they're both wrong in the same way, right? They have the both. I call this like a quasi legal kind of wrongness. Like it deserves the same kind of sanction, or even if they have very different intentions that we might find one far more understandable or one far more blameworthy. If we just want to make cheating entirely about the moral point, I think we've missed the unique sense that cheating has in the concept of games.
Yeah, awesome. So let's shift then one final topic to strategic fouls, right? Because as you talk about in the chapter on cheating, a lot of literature on philosophy of sport seems to want to conceive of strategic fouls as cheating, which no one who's a fan, really, at least in basketball, which is the case that I'm most familiar with, right? The clock's running down, you're behind a few points. What do? You foul the other team intentionally to stop the clock, put someone on the free throw line, hope that they miss a shot or two, get the ball back, get it down as quick as you can, then you do it again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that seems like a very good strategy. It makes the game more exciting that it exists, right? I'm sure the league and NBC or ESPN like it because it makes the game go longer, so there are more commercial breaks, right? So it seems to add
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
value everywhere, but it is an intentional act of rule breaking to advantage your own team, right? One reason to think it's not cheating, goes to the issue of like duplicitousness in the naive version that we talked about before of cheating, right? Where you're fouling in front of the ref, you're doing it to be seen to stop the clock as quickly as possible, as opposed to like hitting another player when the ref's head is turned or something, which would to like injure them or something to get an unfair advantage, which would clearly be an act of cheating. And so how do you conceive then of strategic fouls? And on your view, they're not cheating, so, or at least in some instances, or maybe most instances. So why think of them as non-cheating?
Yeah, and part of I'll admit I've long been puzzled by strategic fouls. So I don't I try to suggest some ways that my view might deal with it, although I do manage to skirt coming up with a really definitive account of strategic fouls because you're right. What's puzzling is here are cases where you're intentionally violating some kind of rule, um, but you're doing it with yeah, the intention is different, right? You want to get caught, right? Whereas in a paradigmatic case of cheating, you're trying to get away with something, right? And here you seem to be within the bounds of the game, right? So it touches on this question. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it. The classic "are cheaters even playing the game" sort of question, right? And some have tried to deal with this by articulating different kinds of rules, right? There are the rules that set up the game, and there are rules that regulate behavior within the game. And maybe a strategic foul is violating the latter but not the former. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to work because accusations of cheating seem to apply across both of these. Um, there is some philosophers have tried to make sort of a penalty price distinction, right? Is there a difference in you've committed a foul and you've been penalized as opposed to a strategic foul where you're sort of willing to pay the price, right? The other team getting free throws is the price you're willing to pay to extend a game. Um, I would like that distinction to work. I'm not entirely sure it does. I think if it did, it would work pretty well with my discussion of sort of predicting how different types of behaviors are going to be penalized. But I think there are probably too many cases where, whether something is a penalty or a price is sort of disputed. And it would be a little bit puzzling if we say at the end of the game, my foul is a price I'm willing to pay to extend the game. Whereas if I commit the same foul in the second quarter because I'm clumsy, now it becomes a punishment for my clumsiness, right? So that's a little bit puzzling. Um, so one approach I do suggest goes back to our earlier discussion of what actually counts as a law, and with something like strategic fouling in basketball, where aside from a few philosophers, I don't really know of. I don't get the sense that the public thinks of a strategic foul as cheating, right? They may not like strategic fouls. They might think it's boring or something like that. But I don't know of any accusations, or at least I'm not aware of a widespread discussion that fouling at the end of a basketball game uh, is cheating. It just, while it's an intentional rule violation, it sort of doesn't match the sense that we have when we talk about intentional rule violation. So maybe this is a bit too easy of an answer, but if there's no expectation of any restorative sanction being applied, uh, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to count that as cheating, as opposed to even like a similar example in basketball. At least in the NBA, they've tried to get rid of fouls where you're like on a fast break, right? So if you have the ball and you're ahead of all of the defenders and somebody grabs you, they really ramped up the punishment for that because they don't want those to happen anymore. So that seems to be a case where at least this particular league is trying to make this distinction where they say we're going to enforce the sanction in this kind of case. So it's almost they're trying to encourage that to become part of the definition of cheating. But I don't think they have any interest in doing that at the end of game scenarios that makes for more interesting games. Now, what what might be interesting is if we look at strategic fouls in other sports where we might have different intuitions, right? So one example I discuss is a soccer example of somebody committing a handball to prevent a goal, which looks very much like the strategic foul in basketball, right? It's paying the penalty shot and the red card and being down a player are, I guess, sort of all prices to be paid for preventing a goal from going in. I think I guess I would say at least I think more people are willing to call that cheating than the basketball strategic foul case. So I guess on my view, you would at least be more of an open question as to whether something like that constitutes cheating because it's perceived differently and there's a different kind of sanction that comes with it. I think some other cases that I think kind of fall into that category are a lot of sports like football or tennis have a lot of like time wasting issues or injury faking issues, right? And I tend to think those probably do count as cheating. They're really hard to enforce, right? If you're seeking unnecessary medical assistance in tennis, there's not really a practical way to determine what was a real injury and what was, a way to stall and almost like calling a timeout. But something like that, I'm sort of happy to call cheating, even though it wasn't exactly a rule violation. The rule is sort of like, don't get unnecessary medical help and don't take too much time. But I think in those cases, we would say, well, if we really had an enforceable way of doing that, we would want that out of the game. Maybe that looks a little bit more like the soccer handball. We don't feel that way about strategic fouls in basketball. And I think that has something to do with looking at the jurisdiction, looking at the legal system, right? The same set of rules does get applied differently, and we have to know that history. Otherwise, we're just doing sort of empty conceptual analysis, right? So again, I think the understanding the concepts is critical, but we have to understand their application, or we've missed what the sport was.
Yeah, and one thought I had as you were differentiating between soccer and basketball is the value of a point in soccer is radically different from the value of a point in basketball because 1-0 is like a good game in soccer, whereas 1 point in basketball in a game where a team may score over 100 points, and so I think that may be like part of what is driving that intuition there and how it's treated among fans and teams, et cetera. That a point's a point in basketball, but a point could be life and death in a really strong way in soccer. But I do want to just touch on. So I said that the strategic fouls was our last topic, but I do want to get back to the question that you brought up of are cheaters really playing the game? Because I think in the philosophy of games, at least in some of the literature, some people want to think about cheaters aren't playing the game, right? Why? Because they're not following the rules, and to play a game is to follow its rules. And so what have they done? Well, they may be playing a different game, right? They, deleted a particular rule, like this rule does not apply to me. And so I'm playing a variation of the game alongside the person who's playing the game properly, right? And so we are playing two different games, right? One that advantages me, but it seems like, at least in the case where you're not being like flagrant about, but public about the fact that you're cheating, right? It seems to everyone that I'm playing the game when in fact, I've got an ace up my sleeve or whatever. And so what are your thoughts on that case? And then we'll end it there.
Yeah, I mean that view is a popular view in philosophy of sport as well, right? That if the goal of a game, or if there's some internal good to winning the game or the sport, that logically I can only attain that if I have followed the rules. So if I have gone outside the rules, uh, yeah, maybe I can gain whatever external good there is, right? I can cheat and I can win and be rewarded with prize money or something like that. But logically, I can't have won because I violated the rule. And I'll admit, I've always been a little bit puzzled about this because I don't know that I have an especially strong argument against that fairly logical point. But from the focus of the participant, where I've always struggled is differentiating the cheater from the accidental rule violator, right? Because I think whatever level of sport we're looking at, I suppose you find this more with youth sports or with newcomers to the sport. But we find all kinds of accidental rule violations in sport. Now, again, some of these are maybe related to fouls or something like that. Um, but like, okay, so let's go back to basketball, right? So imagine there's one player who is very good at sort of deceiving everybody and taking an extra step and traveling, right? And I guess we could say, well, okay, they have cheated, they have gotten away with something, they're logically playing a different game. But compare that to somebody who's just new to basketball and not very good at dribbling and sometimes travels. Like it seems it's puzzling to me. I think you'd have to say that if the cheater's not playing the game, the accidental rule violator isn't playing it either. I'm not convinced that there's aside from the I don't think the intention is that what matters there. It's the logical inconsistency, right? So if to be playing the game you have to be adhering to the rules, I think if we hold that view about cheaters, there's going to be a problem. And now that I'm not sure anybody is ever playing the same game. Now, if it's something where it really is consistent, I guess I'm perfectly happy to say, if we go back to the Uno example, right? And if one person is following Mattel's rules and the other person is playing draw two cards and draw fours whenever they want. I guess if we wanted to say they're playing like parallel games, I guess I'm sort of okay with that. I don't know that that's particularly a problem. Um, but I think rule violations or people not following the rules are so common. I'm just not sure what if we just said all cheaters and other rule violators aren't playing the same game. I'm not sure what that gets us. Like I think that just ends us in sort of an absurd condition where um, everybody is playing their own thing at the same time. It's like when kids have sort of parallel play. Like they're all kind of there, but they're all doing different things. And I guess if that's how it ended up, like okay, but I'm not sure. I'm also not sure how that would be action guiding. I guess would be the question. I'll sort of end that.
Yeah, right. Because we can't be sure of what game the people we're playing with are playing seemingly with us, right? There's a sense in which we're doing an activity together, but in fact, we're doing, the sub activities that make up this activity of play are distinct games, right? And so, yeah, that action guiding stuff becomes damn near impossible, right? Like that form of solipsism, I guess, with respect to gameplay seems so absurd that we need to find another way around that.
And maybe at that point, my view would just be, play. I think is already fictional in various senses, and we don't need to get into that discussion. But maybe there's just another level of fiction of we have to sort of act as if we're playing the same game, even if we're all actually engaged in our own variants of it. Because if we don't have that fiction, then yeah, what are we doing?
Yeah. Awesome. So on that note, Aaron, thank you so much for joining me. This was really awesome.
Thanks, Brandon.
Awesome. And the book, once again, is Sport Realism, a law-inspired theory of sport, Roman and Littlefield, 2022. Definitely check it out, people. So thanks once again, Aaron.
Thanks.